Our projections are merely one piece of the puzzle on our quest for fantasy glory. What we're really after are the best fantasy basketball players, which we can derive from their stats by converting them to fantasy points. Fantasy points are made up of real stats, which is why we projected the real stats for our NBA players. Now it's time to convert our season projections into fantasy points to help us win our draft. Let's import our library and then read in our CSV files. We are going to slice our projected stats and save it to a new data frame. We can do this by reading in our player projected and again taking every row, using all of our projected stats, which is really all we care about since our projected DF CSV has all of our real stats and all of our projected stats from a previous lesson. And then we just want to save this as our projected stats. And let's concatenate with our player info to get the player name and then rename the columns to drop the projections from it. So here we can concat our player info, our DF projected stats, and this is along the columns. And let's just override our DF projected stats. And then again, our DF projected stats, we are going to rename our columns and just copy paste what we've used before, passing in the dictionary with our old column name and our new column name. And let's just use the in place parameter, set it equal to true so we can override our DF projected stats data frame. So now this is updated with our new column names. Let's sample to make sure everything looks good. Great. Next, we're going to create a function to take our rows as inputs and output a new value called fantasy points. I will be using the scoring settings from my ESPN Fantasy League I play in, which uses simple addition and subtraction for each stat type. This is a head-to-head league. So for example, you get 1 point for a point scored, but you're subtracted for each field goal attempt. So that means if you make a 3, you're going to get 3 points, minus 1, it's a 2, so it's worth more. You'll notice in our projections that the field goal made is comprised of the 3-point field goal made, and that points is comprised of our field goal made, our free throws made, and our 3-point field goals made. This is something to keep in mind when modifying our model, as we could drop the points and just use the other columns to calculate the points to make our projections a little more accurate. This class was focused more on learning the fundamentals of Pandas by using NBA stats, so there definitely is room for improvement in our projection model. I digress. Back to our function, fantasy points converter, which again is going to take a row as an input. And if you remember our apply method section of the course, we did something very similar to this. And here we're going to basically say points is equal to the row where the points column. And this could also be the index value. So let's say we wanted to say points is 0, 1, 2, 3. We could do 3. But since some things get out of order, let's go with the column name. And again, we would do the same thing for field goals made. And just to make it easier, I'm going to copy paste in the rest of them. And here our fantasy points is going to equal points plus field goals made minus field goals attempted plus free throws made minus free throws attempted plus OREB plus DREB plus assists plus steals minus turnovers and plus blocks. And we will return that fantasy points value. So this is how we score in the league. And let's run this. And remember, we can now apply the method and use the axis equals 1 argument, or you could spell out columns, to get our new fantasy points value. So if we took our DF projected stats and we applied, now remember it's expecting a function which we just wrote here, and then we want to say apply this over each column. And it's going to save it as a series, which means we want to save it as fantasy value. And we could run that. And then from here, we need to take our series and add it as a new column to our data frame. So now in our data frame of df projected stats, we have a new column, fantasy points, and that is going to be equal to the fantasy value, which is what we just got here from applying our function. And then we can sort the values based on fantasy points in descending order by calling false on ascending, and we should have our first look at our top fantasy guys for the 2018-19 season. So if we now go df projected stats, we sort the values on fantasy points, and we say ascending equals false. LeBron, Westbrook, Giannis, Anthony Davis have the highest fantasy points. And then let's round it to two numbers after the float and get this puppy ready for an export. So if we take this and merely we're going to round it to 2. And we'll take the df for export. And then we can save this to a CSV, this time calling in our relative path of NBA stats CSV, and we'll save it as projected fantasy points final 2018-19, and we can ignore the index, set it equal to false since we don't care about that number. We run that, and now we can turn to importing this file into our Google Sheets to help us with the draft.